Let's dive right into this explainer, because honestly, we're looking at the absolute most fascinating story ever told, our own. We're going to track how we went from literal floating atoms to humble hunter-gatherers, all the way up to building these massive global empires. And as you'll see as we go through this whole epic journey is driven by the exact same human desires, just repeating themselves over and over again throughout history.
Now, the sheer epic scale of our timeline here is just staggering. I mean, for billions of years, we were basically just atoms floating around in a giant global petri dish. The very first hominids only show up about 6 million years ago. But then, and this is practically overnight in the grand scheme of time, we completely dropped hunting and gathering. By 4000 BCE, humans in the Sumerian city of Uruk were out there successfully harvesting cereal grains like wheat and barley, which officially kicked off the true dawn of civilization.
But this wasn't just a simple lifestyle change. Civilization actually came with a massive biological trade-off. By settling down to farm, men shrank from being these 5'9" super athletes to, well, roughly 5'3" farmers. We got physically smaller, and we became completely landlocked to our crops. But here's the thing, this trade-off absolutely worked. Having a reliable human-created food source meant our populations could just boom. Uruk actually hit over 50,000 residents. So as these early populations started to explode, humans desperately needed to find some kind of order in all that chaos. Enter Babylonian King Hammurabi around 1772 BCE. He created a society that was strictly based on a written legal code. You've probably heard his famous mandate: if a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. This laid out strict rules that boxed people into specific social classes. It really proves that right from the get-go, human society was heavily structured on unequal class value and, frankly, some pretty severe punishments.
And this brings us to something that brilliantly illustrates another universal human drive, and that is our deep fear of mortality. While the Mesopotamians were busy writing laws, the Egyptians were totally obsessed with just one concept: immortality. You had pharaohs like Khufu commanding literally unimaginable manual labor over decades just to build those massive pyramids. They truly believed these structures would guarantee their spirit ruled the afterlife forever. It's this universal fear of death, which, by the way, is a theme the legendary Sumerian king Gilgamesh also recognizes the inevitable, shared tragedy of the human experience.
Now, if we swing over to ancient China, order and legacy were maintained through a very different but equally fascinating concept called the mandate of heaven. Basically, this philosophical idea dictated that heaven grants an emperor the absolute right to rule, but it's strictly based on their merit and virtue. So, if a ruler got corrupt or weak, well, heaven would send down natural disasters like floods or earthquakes just to signal that their time was up. It's actually a really brilliant cycle that justified the rise and inevitable fall of powerful dynasties, like when they transitioned from the Shang to the Zhou dynasty. Okay, let's jump to ancient Greece for a second, because here we find this stark, almost night and day contrast between two incredibly powerful city-states. On one side, you've got Sparta. This was a brutal, highly disciplined society entirely focused on militarism and war, and they relied heavily on enslaved helot labor just to survive. Then, on the flip side, there's Athens. Athens was a chaotic, vote-driven democracy where a council of 500 was chosen completely at random through a process called sortition. We're talking about two totally different answers to that fundamental question of how humans should actually govern themselves. Now, as you might guess, not everyone was a fan of this messy Athenian democracy. The famous Greek philosopher Plato actually thought the whole idea of randomly selecting everyday citizens to run the state was pretty barbaric. He believed the common man was utterly unfit to navigate the complex ship of society. He argued that there would literally be no end to the troubles till philosophers become rulers. Instead of the chaotic whims of the crowd, he advocated for a wise philosopher king, someone dedicated entirely to logic, reason, and justice. Of course, if you were just an average, everyday person back then, life was way less about ruling a state and much more about just trying to survive the harsh realities of farming and constant global warfare. And to cope with all that stress, these incredible macro philosophies started emerging all over the world. You had Siddhartha Gautama achieving enlightenment to become the Buddha, finding inner peace completely separate from worldly suffering. Over in China, Confucianism was providing strict social order and duty, while Taoism taught people to find harmony by just aligning with the natural flow of the universe, perfectly represented by yin and yang. These philosophies really gave people a sense of inner peace when the outside world was anything but peaceful. But here's the catch. Despite all these philosophies of peace, human ambition is an overwhelmingly powerful thing. We see this cycle repeat constantly throughout our history. Human ambition drives massive, aggressive expansion. And that leads us to a really fundamental question. Why do empires always fall? Seriously, why is it that the exact moment a civilization reaches that global superpower status, it almost inevitably begins to collapse under its own colossal weight? To answer that, just look at Alexander the Great. Tutored by Aristotle himself, Alexander literally conquered the known world, spreading Greek ideals all the way over to India. But then, absolute tragedy strikes. He suddenly dies at just 32 years old. And without his singular unifying force keeping things together, his ambitious generals immediately started feuding. They fractured and divided this massive empire into three much weaker pieces. It just goes to show how incredibly fragile human civilization truly is when the whole thing is built on the shoulders of just one person. And we see that exact same fragility play out in Rome, too. This was a civilization that evolved from a tiny little city into a massive republic and eventually became a dictatorship the moment Julius Caesar boldly crossed the Rubicon to seize power. But you know what? Even after it transitioned into a full-blown empire under Augustus, this unmatched Western superpower just couldn't sustain itself forever. Plagued by internal divisions, massive overexpansion, and eventually succumbing to barbarian invaders, Western Rome officially fell in 476 AD. But what I find truly amazing about human history is that the light of progress never goes out everywhere at once. While Western Europe was plunging headfirst into a so-called Dark Age after the fall of Rome, just look at what was happening over in India. Under the Gupta Empire, India was entering this spectacular mathematical golden age. You had the astronomer Aryabhata out there calculating the Earth's circumference and proving it was round, while mathematicians like Brahmagupta were officially utilizing the concept of zero. It brilliantly illustrates that human innovation never, ever truly stops across the globe. Meanwhile, back in Europe, things were getting pretty terrifying. The constant threat of Viking raids was completely reshaping society. In order to just survive, the masses desperately traded away their personal freedom for sheer physical safety. And that firmly entrenched a brand new system, feudalism. It became this incredibly rigid, unmoving social pyramid. Serfs were permanently tied down to the land to farm, knights offered military protection, nobles managed the territories, and kings or the pope sat right up at the very top, claiming ultimate divine authority. So why did everyday people just accept this setup? Well, Niccolò Machiavelli perfectly captured the psychology of this cyclical oppression in his famous manifesto, The Prince. He wrote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved." And it's true. Ordinary, hardworking farmers wouldn't dare rebel against their harsh noble overlords because they feared the brutal outside threats, like those Vikings, way more than they actually desired their own personal freedom. Fear, as it turns out, is the absolute ultimate tool for social control. Now, this ruthless pursuit of power through fear is perfectly mirrored over in the East by Genghis Khan. By uniting the nomadic Mongol tribes, he unleashed some of the absolute most terrifying conquests in human history. He even ruthlessly used captured civilians as human shields during his brutal sieges. But his impact on the world was just undeniable. He went on to create the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. And incredibly, his genetic legacy is so vast today that roughly 8% of South Asian men actually carry his DNA. Crazy, right? But listen, if emperors and khans thought they were the ultimate power on Earth, nature very quickly reminded them otherwise. The bubonic plague wiped out somewhere between 75 and 200 million people as it spread mercilessly across trade ships and the Silk Road. Nature really is the ultimate equalizer. But ironically enough, with so much of the global workforce completely decimated, those powerful landowners were suddenly forced to give their surviving peasant workers significantly more rights and a much larger share of their crops. Okay, let's fast forward to the collision of worlds, because this brought unprecedented devastation. When Old World European explorers finally reached the Americas, they encountered massive, highly advanced empires like the Aztecs and the Incas. However, the Europeans had some devastating advantages. They had advanced military weaponry like guns and cannons, and even more destructively, they had biological immunity. Invisible biohazards, mostly smallpox, just absolutely decimated the susceptible native populations. And that allowed European conquerors to violently and swiftly claim the New World. Yet, despite millennia of dealing with kings, emperors, and ruthless conquerors, that fundamental human desire for self-rule, it always comes bouncing back. You can trace this incredible pushback right to the Magna Carta in 1215, which legally limited an English king's absolute rights for the very first time.
And that desire eventually exploded centuries later into full-blown, bloody revolutions. We went from the United States declaring its independence from Britain in 1776, all the way to the French dramatically and violently overthrowing their own monarchy in 1789. As the world modernized, the Industrial Revolution brought us some incredible technological leaps, but it also brought along massive new wealth inequalities. And that sparked completely new philosophies on how society should be structured. Observing the incredibly harsh, grueling conditions of the working class, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto. They were calling for the ultimate workers' rebellion against the elite bourgeoisie, arguing that the proletarians had literally nothing to lose but their chains. So all this constant, aggressive jockeying for global dominance, it eventually pushed human civilization to the absolute brink. European powers ruthlessly divided up an entire continent with artificial borders during the scramble for Africa. And soon after that, complex alliance webs and a single assassination sparked the unimaginable global devastation of World War I. Just a few short decades later, the brutal empire-building ambitions of Adolf Hitler triggered World War II. Millions upon millions of people died before the conflict finally ended, ushering humanity right into the terrifying atomic age. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. The ancient Sumerians actually understood this exact reality thousands of years ago in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The quote goes, "For when gods created man, they let death be his share." We've seen today that human history is just this relentless, echoing cycle of rising empires, breathtaking innovations, and incredibly bloody falls. So knowing that our individual time here is limited, what does our desperate ongoing quest to build a permanent legacy say about where humanity is going